John Sims from the British Library is going to give us a tour of the resources, which is, I'm sure, immense and enormous.
Yep, vast and various.
Anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here again. And as I mentioned earlier, my name's John Sims. I'm from the British Library. I've been there about 10 years, and part of that is involved talking with researchers about their information needs and going back to the library and seeing what resources we have other than the traditional law library materials, and seeing how those can support people's research. And so, in the context of the Women's Legal Landmarks Project, I hope to give you some insight into the kind of things that we have. So the main aims really are to show you some examples of the resources that are less readily available elsewhere, some of which are less readily available elsewhere, and to help you to understand how to immerse yourself in the historical context of some of your landmarks, get closer to the people and the action, and to show you how to access some of them. As I mentioned, the resources at the British Library are very vast and various. Several different national libraries were brought together under the same administrative umbrella in the 1970s, most of which moved to the St Pancras reading rooms in the 90s. The last collection to arrive from Colindale, the newspaper library, has opened its front doors in the St Pancras building just in the last year or so with a new news room. Manuscripts and archives have always been at the heart of the collections. What I want to point out in this slide is that it's quite difficult to find one representative example to take you through the finding and interrogation process. Manuscripts and archives, as I mentioned, can be searched in an integrated fashion through this website catalogue, the Search Archives, and generally have to be viewed in the manuscripts reading room. But within that collection, there are various different archives. There's lots of information, lots of collections of private papers for public figures, some of which include public records, some of which are just private records. There are wholesale public records relating to the administration of justice and the administration of India up until 1947 as well in the India Office records. And there are a number of other institutional archives relating to publishing predominantly, but the majority are private papers. One of the eldest landmarks that I saw on the list was the Welsh Project. I think it's Hywel Da. I don't know if the person doing that landmark is here today, but for example, just to give you an example of the historical depth, there's a 9th century manuscript, a 10th century manuscript actually it's a 13th century manuscript of the 10th century laws of Hywel Da. And to use that as an example of the variety of ways in which you will need to access the collection. This particular item, because of its rarity, requires a letter of introduction before you're allowed near it. That's not typical of the whole collection, but it's one of the varieties of hurdles, I suppose. Books and journals, of course, are part of the collection, and the main catalogue for exploring, searching and requesting the items is the Explore BL UK. And again, that's an integrated search across several of the old collections. And again, for access purposes, there are varied reading rooms, and I'll give some examples that show the types of variety and things that you need to know. There are varieties in terms of the time that you need to wait for the delivery of the item. Some are in the store and beneath the building and take 70 minutes. Others are stored in Yorkshire and take 48 hours. So there's a necessity to plan in advance quite often. You can order items in advance, as we will see. There are also copying restrictions which determine, in some cases, where you have to use something or the way in which you have to use something. Another example of the variety of the collections is shown by the oral history recordings. It used to be the National Institute of Recorded Sound. Within that collection there are oral history programs, oral history collections, including a Legal Lives program, which includes a long recording with Brenda Hale, and a separate program, which I'll talk about in the second half, on the women's liberation movement, second generation UK feminists. Some of the short clips are from the Women's Liberation Project are available on a website, but you'll need to access the whole recordings by actually visiting St Pancras and requesting the sound file to be served on the sound server, which is basically just clicking on the right catalogue record and putting the headphones on. But the point is, different ways of accessing the material, different types of ways of getting your hands on them or ears on them. And newspapers, as I mentioned, have moved into St Pancras quite recently. Again, some of them are digitised, many are digitised. Some newspapers you'll be able to access in commercially available newspaper online resources that you'll be able to access from your institutions or your local libraries. Others, if your institution doesn't subscribe, you can access them freely at the British Library. But then again, stuff which hasn't been digitised, you'll need to think about ordering it to the reading room, probably a 48-hour wait, more planning. Databases, web archive, the list goes on. But you can explore the website and see the full variety. There are questions about which catalogues and finding aids. I've mentioned the top two there already a little bit, but there are more specialised finding aids relating to particular collections. You'll find them in particular reading rooms. There's a manuscripts reading room. There's a social science reading room at the moment where you'll find indexes and materials for helping to discover statutes, law reports, and so on. There's an APAC, Asia Pacific and Africa Collections reading room, which will have hand lists for the India Office records and expert help at the inquiry desks in those different reading rooms as well. So these issues of how to request, which reading room to go to and who to ask are problematic, but in the course of this next 15 minutes, I hope to give you some examples that make it a little clearer. So how am I going to do that? I'm taking a case study approach of researching the obscenity trials of Radcliffe Hall's novel, The Well of Loneliness, providing you some examples of the sources for context and evidence of the events and how to access them. And in the second half, I'm standing in for Polly Russell. Dr. Russell was unable to be here, and reading her script, basically, with the slides that she's prepared for you. I'm asked an enormous amount of detail, some of which I have in notes, and if it's your project, Caroline would be happy to talk about it later if there's anything you don't already know. But forgive me if I'm a bit sketchy on the detail. Having to assemble this massive information into a kind of coherent narrative has left me probably a little light on details in places, but do ask afterwards if there's anything that you want me to be more specific about, references to the dates of publications, shelf marks and so on. And I'll be able to dig it out of my notes and email you. So there were two main trials, 1928 to a trial and an appeal, which as far as I know was a rerun. And in the United States, the 1928 trial in London suppressed the book under the Obscene Publications Act, and the United States trial eventually liberated the book. One of my starting points was this catalogue, this online database, which you can access for free in the British Library, and I have a feeling that a light version or a version of it may be freely available in any case. It's called Orlando. It's a database of British women's writing. It gives bibliographic information in the sense of a list of all the works that person has done, biographical information and timelines, links, and it was especially useful because it does give a timeline of the obscenity trials, some key points with links through to entries elsewhere in the database about other people. I suppose the general point about this is it's in terms of understanding the cultural environment, the kind of ideas that were circulating, the kind of ideas that women were writing about at any point in time can be usefully explored for a starting point in this database. Very pertinent to the trial was the treatment in the press. I won't go into detail. Like I said, you can press me afterwards if you would like. Lots of the writing that's there's so much been written about the trial that you can probably read all this anyway in some of the sources that I can signpost to you. But the way that even prior to the trial, the relationship between Hall and I think at that time her partner Trowbridge, Una Trowbridge, was publicised, put on a public pedestal, examined, scrutinised, predates the furore that was in the press at the time, the vials of prussic acid, etc., again, if you want to know more about that, then please let me know. But you can see here the Daily Express from shortly before the trial took place. The previous day, in the Sunday Express, a paper which we don't, as far as I could work out, have accessible in the online version. You probably need to use the paper version. Saw the editor calling for the suppression of this obscene book, and how he would rather give a vial of prussic acid to a healthy child than allow the child to read the book. And the mudslinging it continued, and the way that the book and the author were treated is very much in the public domain during this period, and I think it's nice to be able to contextualise that with whatever else was going on. Just to the bottom right of this, you'll find that, unfortunately, we didn't have room. There was an advert for finance for furniture, some kind of pay as you go, pay later type of thing, where a couple of men are discussing the finance, and there's a woman going, that's nice, it's furniture. And I just thought that was quite a nice comparison of the sort of the cultural different images of gender, and all together in the same page. This cartoon archive isn't the British Library source. I've mentioned it here for two reasons. I suppose the specific point for the case study is that I keep pointing here, you're not going to be able to see that. This cartoon is the Home Secretary, Joyce Joynson Hicks, dressed up as a nursemaid, burning books which are unsuitable for the children. The resonance, I don't think, is lost on anybody. Joynson Hicks was the recipient of a letter by the publisher in the larger story, the details of which I'm going to skirt over. It was satirised extensively, and has also been the subject of much of the scholarship to do with the abuse of process in relation to the trial. The public image of Joynson Hicks, as circulated in these cartoons, I think adds another interesting contextual dimension. The more general point, I suppose, is that this is a resource which is freely available on the web, which it stands on its own merits, obviously, for helping you identify these images. It gives you a visual way of exploring the issues, but it also helps you to point back to resources in the British Library or anywhere else that you might want to access the articles. This cartoon was published in the Evening Standard on a date which is given in the, I can't even see it here, it's 1928 sometime, which will then signpost you back to the Evening Standard if you want to go to a newspaper archive and read it and see what else was going on that day to contextualise your study. Excuse the badly cropped images here. This is my own anxiety about the way in which we are allowed to copy images, not knowing whether the photographers were still alive, not able to determine whether it was out of copyright, and so on. This is a kind of institutional anxiety about the way that copyright conspires to silence, which is another theme that I think Paul was aware of, that I think the whole environment of suppression of literature is obviously tuned into. The library manages that in different ways, in terms of the actual management and metadata associated with suppressed books, the way that they're allowed to be used in certain contexts, as well as their role in either preserving or propagating identities of women, or identities of any ideas that have been published and suppressed, contributing in some way, supporting or providing barriers to the circulation of those ideas. I wanted to highlight this particular resource, though, because again it's a pictorial resource. On the right-hand side, you have it's from the States. It's the lawless decade, the 1920s, post-war, decade after post-war. It enables you to flick through and under various different themes to do with prohibition and flapper culture, new women culture, police arresting women in bathing suits because they're too scantily clad and all this kind of stuff, whereas the top picture was women in Hollywood were allowed to dress like that. I think this is the gist of the text in the middle there. But it's a book that you can get at the library. There are various other sources of getting this kind of visual information for the period. So some of the books, on the left-hand side you have the first edition, the one that was, and the second Pegasus edition that was published in France when Jonathan Cape sent the, I don't know what they're called, the impressions off to France to be printed up. These were the subject of the trial, and the order was to confiscate them and suppress them. But later editions have been published right up until, well, even more recently on the far side there, the Virago 1982 edition. There are a couple of other books in between which I'll pause on for the moment, because I want to just bring your attention to this in the middle, which is a text copied from, I think, either this one or this one, by a biographer in possibly the 1940s. His name, he was one of the executors of the literary estate of Una Trowbridge. She wrote a biography of her partner, and his archives contain transcripts of the trials in London and in the United States, as well as various other clippings, and this photocopy, which is an introduction commending the book by Havelock Ellis, a sexologist, psychologist. I won't embarrass myself by misplacing his disciplinary orientation any further, but the point is that he was a very significant person, both in terms of attempting to provide credibility for Hall's novel, and in terms of an archival resource for exploring the people that were involved in the situation. So, what's his name? Dixon, the owner of this particular archive, Lovett Dixon. The materials are now well, they're freely available online, but they're associated with the National Archives in Canada. I've got more details in a second. He was obviously noted, just have a look at this, Cut 802C9, it's this one. It's the shelf mark for the British Library, so I suspect that he came into the British Museum, as it was then, photocopied this introduction from Havelock Ellis. Ellis wrote about sexuality, about lesbian sexuality in the context of this work here, Studies in Psychology of Sex, Sexual Inversion, which was if you like, the pool of thinking which helped, or ostensibly helped, Hall to characterise Stephen in her novel. By writing this introduction, I suppose it helped to promote the novel in a certain way. What's interesting in comparison with the lack of this introduction by the time you get to the Virago edition is that by the 1980s, this kind of outdated quasi-scientific thinking is exactly that. It's viewed in that way. So, whereas in 1928 it was an acceptable way of characterising lesbian identity, which Hall felt that it was beneficial for her to buy into, and thinking had moved on by the 1980s and had sort of discredited this thinking. This is kind of analysis that's available widely, but I just wanted to point it out for the point of view of the archival resources. Ellis himself had also drawn from Kraft-Ebing, I can't pronounce this, but Psychopathia Sexualis, which again was another of this modes of thinking about sexuality, which by the time of the 1980s had become outdated, quasi-scientific. Other forms of literary censorship. Underneath the Defence of the Realm Act, Rose Alatini, in Despised and Rejected, was also suppressed in 1918. James Joyce Ulysses, there are reportedly Home Office files in the National Archives which provide evidence for the fact that it was regarded as a work which would be suppressed, but the person who wanted to print it couldn't find anyone to print it. The person who wanted to publish it couldn't find a printer, and it was the subject of a long-running legal dispute in the States, which Morris Ernst finally managed to overturn and liberate the book. He was also the lawyer in the, if I'm getting this correct, in the US side of the trials for the Well of Loneliness. And this entry here, talk about Theatre Act censorship, this is in the context of the Lord Chamberlain's office, who used to read and review plays before they could be put onto the stage, another form of censorship. And this quotation from Stephen Nicholson's book here, I think, speaks for itself. By the time that Wolfenden reported in '57, the Lord Chamberlain had never passed a play about lesbianism. I suppose there are 2 points I'd like to make about that. One, in terms of signposting archival resources, is the Lord Chamberlain's collection at the British Library, which I'm not sure if I've got a further slide on. The point is that we have the correspondence between the Lord Chamberlain's office and the playwrights or the agents of the playwrights, detailing why X or Y is deemed unsuitable, revisions of the text. We have the transcripts of the text which had to be submitted. By the time the Theatre Act 1968 was passed, which abolished this type of censorship, it was decided that this resource of play transcripts, it would be a shame if it totally dried up. And so by the time the Scottish writer, I can't remember her name offhand, did a stage version of The Well of Loneliness, in theory, it is. I found a catalogue record. There's a transcript of a stage play for The Well of Loneliness in the collection as well, in this same collection of Lord Chamberlain's plays. By comparison, 2 satires in the same year weren't deemed. The Well of Sleevelessness and The Sink of Solitude, which again you can find at the British Library in original editions, were deemed to be fine. So how do you get your hands on these books? As I mentioned, Explore the British Library is the main catalogue. Once you've found the thing you're looking for, click on I want this. You'll then be faced with trying to choose which reading room you want to have it sent to. Unfortunately, I couldn't actually follow this line through properly because I've got one of these on hold and somebody else has one of these others on hold. Item in use by a public reader, I don't know who that is, she's looking at Rose Alatini, whose pseudonym was A.T. Fitzroy. And The Well of Loneliness obviously hadn't made its way back to the store by the time I did this screenshot. But something I've been working on, which was in my basket, anyway, I ticked it here, and then I chose that I wanted it delivered to the rear books reading room. It tells me that it's going to take 48 hours to deliver. You click on go, and it arrives. You can check in. As long as you're logged in up here, you can see that it says log out. If you weren't logged in, it would tell you to log in, and then it would enable you to do this. While you're logged in, you can check on My Reading Room Requests to see if your item has arrived. In the case, as is the case with this, which I'd hope to be able to show, this list of various options will be restricted just to rare books reading room or manuscripts reading room if it's a manuscripts item. So you're not always faced with this. In fact, you won't be faced with anything there below. That's staff options. But sometimes the choice of reading room is restricted for you. Once I got the item into the reading room, I was told I had to use it at one of these desks. No photography allowed except with permission from the curators. Well, I wanted to have a look at various different editions a couple of days ago, so I had to write to the curators and get permission, or find out, so they had to jump through hoops about copyright and preservation, whether it was considered to be vulnerable. I got an email saying it's okay, but it is a thing you have to consider. If you want to take copies, plan plenty time and be prepared for this type of stuff. There were editions published in Czech. The Pegasus editions were the domain of the French studies curator. This particular first Jonathan Cape edition was the English language collections curator. So the issue of who to ask can be perplexing sometimes. In terms of Havelock, Ellis and Kraft Ebbing's input into the characterization of lesbian identity, this is a particularly interesting episode, which is the Criminal Law Amendment Bill of 1921 proposed that what's the quote? Gross indecency between female be put on the same footing as the same offence for men. And the language is probably in context of its time. It's not that shocking. It was shocking to me, particularly one MP who started talking about the whole silence issue. The best way of dealing with this kind of issue, I won't go into detail, is to silence it so that nobody else finds out about it. Another part of the argument who said, well, for those of you who don't know about this, the main texts to go to are Havelock, Ellis and Kraft Ebbing, bringing us back to that one of those earlier slides. But a more general issue is that this kind of material, this is a copy of one of the Lords' reprints of the bill, more difficult to find. Murray mentioned, I think, that there are some projects afoot to perhaps get this stuff online. It's problematic. The way that we have it bound at the British Library is also problematic. It's a very idiosyncratic way. So you might be successful in identifying that the report stage with marshal list of amendments, which are signified by a long string of numbers and digits, is the one that you want to look at. But then trying to find it in our collection requires that you go to a finding aid, which you'll find in the social science reading room, and get some help from the desk, work out which one. Maybe even still have to put in a paper ticket, possibly plan in enough time for it to go wrong. It's only 70 minutes at the moment, providing they don't move it up to Yorkshire, but plan some time. So the bills are hard to access. The debate around it is also harder to access than it might be. It's the debate on the Millbank systems Hansard around this bill is not captured, unfortunately. So you will have to go to the hard volumes, which are in the social science reading room on open access and in a ream of other places. More legislation, if you're not able to find it as enacted, the context, different types of legislation, which was new at the time or had some kind of something to do with suppression. Anyway, all of these things you can find on the open shelves in the social science reading room. If you want to look at the old law books, which the magistrate may have been using or those at the time wanted to, may have consulted, we have an archive set of the first edition of Halsbury's, again, which is in theory orderable from the catalogue, but the social science reading room may need to give you a little bit of extra help to get your hands on the copy. So the relevant volumes were found from the entry in the index, volume 21, volume 9, volume 9. So you can order up the index, or you could probably order up the whole lot, or you can email me and I can see if I can get some time to go down to the basement and do this and identify the right volumes for you. The supplement for 1928 points you to the Hickling test here in the Queen's Bench reports, which, well, law reports aren't really in scope here. I'm sure you can all access those. But anyway, at a point in time, legal research is still possible from the archived books. So some brief pointers for getting help with this kind of stuff. Time, is there a clock anywhere? Does anyone know how I'm getting on for time? Okay. Thank you. Social science reading room I've mentioned is the place to get help with old law books. When I say old, probably they're classified in British Library terms as modern law books. So 1830 onwards, I think, probably. Anything which doesn't restrict its access to the rare books reading room. But in general, if you want the kind of material I've been talking about, the social science reading room will help with those, access to those, and official publications, OPs. Statutes and SIs from 1800 and 1890, respectively, are on the open shelves. You can get help with retrieving the older material. If you want to do point-in-time research on individual statutes, this is quite useful. So every year it's published, and it tells you, well, how had that statute been amended up to that point in time. Revised editions of SIs in multiple volumes take snapshots of what's at large at those different dates. These are the contact details: email for social science inquiries, direct telephone. There's an inquiry desk in the reading room. and there are some online collection guides, parliamentary papers, Central Office of Information Archive, subordinate legislation, and so on. Okay, this is the point I made earlier. I just wanted to draw your attention to the way that Ellis name checks Kraft Ebbing. I think the context is already covered that. Oh, sorry, that quote, yes, did I say, came in the introduction to the 1982 edition, where Havelock Ellis's forward was removed and a feminist forward was gave this quotation about the sexology context. Records and correspondence, the Beale collections in their archival context. Havelock Ellis's papers, I don't know if there are others collections elsewhere, it's quite probable, but there is a large collection of Havelock Ellis's papers at the British Library, including correspondence between Hall and Ellis, and her partner, Trubridge, letters between Jonathan Cape, letter to Havelock Ellis from Jonathan Cape, the publisher, and a note on Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness by Henry Havelock Ellis. So this material, again, offers you some evidence of the action and the dynamics between the characters involved. Other collections which may be relevant, Mary Stokes, together with Havelock Ellis, part of the social hygiene movement. Bernard Shaw papers. Well, you can read one of this. It's correspondence between these characters. Anyway, the Society of Authors archive is one of the institutional archives that I was referred to earlier. Again, correspondence with Hall in the relevant period. So resources outside the British Library that hopefully our resources will enable you to interrogate include the Lubbock Dixon archive, which I'd mentioned earlier. Here's a transcript from the Newington Session House hearing, I think, in which Radcliffe Hall is chastised by the magistrate for interrupting the proceedings. I protest, I am that writer, she says. I would ask people not to interrupt the court. I am the authoress of this work, she says. And the magistrate again then says, if you come up with a behaviour yourself, I'll have to have you removed. Anyway, it's pretty much a verbatim transcript, I think, of some of the proceedings. I'm not sure if it includes a record of the entire proceedings, but it's something to get started on. Generally speaking, oh yeah, this is, I mentioned I found this online. Each slide is signified by an image number, and I did a bit of a trawl through to try and find the start and finish image numbers for some of these bits listed here. So if you want more information about that, I can give you what I've done so far. It'll save you having to do it from scratch, if that's your thing. I suppose the more general point to make is that by and large, the British Library doesn't have transcripts of proceedings in court cases, with one major exception being Privy Council proceedings, Judicial Committee of Privy Council proceedings, which is notable for women's legal landmarks in several instances. There are several cases which, if you're interested to know more about, I can speak to you afterwards. As a rule, we don't have collections of transcripts of proceedings. Occasionally, more than you'll get in the law reports does turn up in the private papers of particular people involved in a case. Another important collection is this one in the University of Texas. This is as far as I got. There are finding aids which help you to explore the contents of each of the boxes in the relevant cases. And again, I can email you these links if you want them. But just to put it into context, it's good to know that these archives are dispersed around the world. National Archives at Kew, there are various files which can be, have already been digitised, and some of them are accessible on their website for free if you don't mind the big A sort of watermark in front, or you can pay money to have a copy sent to you. There are a small representative, well, I don't know if they're represented, a small number of those relating to the trial which can be found there. What's her name? Yeah, Diana Suami's book, The Trials of Radcliffe Hall, was able to get a lot of papers released, and which are now available at the National Archives. You can read her book and find out about that. You can also read Hugh Clayton's doctoral thesis, which goes into a lot of detail and reviews some of the previous work, and also gives you signposts to a lot of the archival material. So just to recap on what I think I've already said about the guides for the Lovat Dixon and Harry Ransom Archives, National Archives catalogue, that Q helps you to discover not only what they have, but will also help you to search across sort of the distributed National Archive, as well as signposting you to archives around the world. I'm afraid it's too long since I've done detailed investigation. I think they're fairly easy to find now. I'm thinking almost on the home page of the National Archives website. But they used to include things like a directory of archives and M25, and search across multiple local records centres, and a list of acquisitions to archives, which was quite good. I found a couple of files of materials from solicitors' firms which turned up on that list, having been sent off in the direction of one or other local archives. And yes, the British Library Search Archives, as I've already mentioned there. You may see these acronyms occasionally, or hear them if you're talking to people. Search Our Catalogue, Archives and Manuscripts, or Integrated Archives and Manuscripts System. That's some of the kind of catalogues speak different ways of referring to the same archives catalogue. I think, hopefully this is the last thing, just to show you how the archives catalogue is used. You can do a search on Radcliffe Hall, and it brings up relevant records. There's usually a person record, and associated with that person record are further records which relate to the various collections, some of which I've mentioned, the Havelock, Ellis, and so on. If you want to get your hands on them, it's a different procedure to the Explore catalogue, the one that you predominantly use for books. So the first thing you need to do is dig down into the kind of nested records, so records within records. The Havelock Ellis papers, if you dig down by going browse this collection, you'll eventually get to different, I think they're called fonds. I'm not an archivist, I'm afraid, I'm a librarian, but basically it's the concept is like a Russian doll. And you'll find a record here describing volume 16 of the Havelock Ellis papers. It gives you a manuscript reference number, add additional manuscripts, add MS 70539. You need to make a note of that. Before you actually need to use that record, you can browse further and see what's included in that add MS 70, whatever it was, 70539, and you can see the other letters that are collected, as well as the letters of Radcliffe Hall and Unitrine Bridge. But at that point, then you'll need to click on, it's not really clear, but there's a thing up here saying browse other collections. It's really not as clear as I'd hoped. You need to follow the links basically in order to select the right type of manuscripts collection. These are part of the Western manuscripts collection. So clicking Access Other Collections here will bring up this page. Select Western manuscripts collection. You then get the opportunity to type in the additional number that I mentioned before, and then it's familiar progress from the other type of catalogue. You select it's limited to the manuscripts reading room. And you collect, you press request, and it sends off the request to the relevant storage room. They bring the materials to the reading room for you. I think this is the last slide. I just wanted to kind of point out that some of the critique cannot act as a finding aid to the archival resources. Some of the work, this is the woman who got the files released from the Home Office. And this PhD thesis I found very informative. It reviews some of the work. It gives probably better referencing to the archival shelf marks, file records, file numbers. And you can access this PhD thesis freely online through this ethos system, which it sounds like looks like some of you are aware of. I did a quick search, very blunt search on women and law, and found quite a large number, nearly all of which were available, already digitised and can be downloaded for free. And yes, that's it. So I'm going to have a quick pause while I switch over to poly mode, and perhaps we take questions at the end.